Hi everybody, and welcome to our continuation of our ecology lectures. Today we're going to talk about energy flow in the ecosystem. Previously, we talked about species interactions. So to recap really quickly on species interactions, we talked about different types of ways that species interact with each other. We talked about competition, we talked about predation, we talked about different types of symbiosis. Today we're going to see how species interactions affect how energy flows. And today, we're also going to talk about keystone species. So this is a 2-for-1 special. To begin, when we think about energy, we think of a guiding question, and that is our essential question for this specific topic. We think about how does the flow of energy through an ecosystem impact the number of species and types of species that can survive in an ecosystem. We're going to quickly see and realize energy is not an infinite source. We have a finite or limited amount of energy, and that is going to impact how many organisms we can have, how species are going to act with each other. Okay, let's think more deeply about what energy is. We know, as scientists, and you'll learn more about this in physics, that matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed. Right? To move energy around from organism to organism, we can only change its form. That's how it moves through ecosystems. If you change the form of matter or of energy, then you're not breaking the rule of matter cannot be created or destroyed, and you can cycle it around. We say that energy flows through an ecosystem, okay? It flows, and matter cycles through an ecosystem. We'll talk more about how matter cycles through an ecosystem in a later video lecture, but for today, we're going to talk about how energy flows through an ecosystem. Make sure that you underline these words or write them in all caps because this is going to be a surprise tool for later. Let's start by thinking about how species will interact with each other and get that energy moving. So you've probably heard of what a consumer is. Not a shopper, but an organism that will eat another organism for energy. Okay, so like a deer eating grass or whatever they eat, leafy objects, or a tiger eating a bird. I don't know what tigers eat, to be honest, right? When something eats another organism, we say that they're heterotrophs because they eat something else. We have something else. We have another word for something that does the opposite of this. We have a thing called a producer, and a producer makes their own food. Because they make their own food, we call them autotrophs, meaning that they create their own source of energy, they create their own food, they're good to go. Usually we see that some consumers will eat autotrophs. That's the example of deer eating grass. One key thing, remember, energy cannot be created or destroyed, just the form of the energy will change. And energy flows. Once again, energy flows through ecosystems. Where did that energy originally come from? That's a good question. It came from the sun. Nearly all energy originates from the sun. But that's kind of like well, why does that happen? Because of something nifty that we learned about last semester, photosynthesis. Due to photosynthesis, autotrophs, like plants, hint, hint, they can photosynthesize and they can make their own food. Some deer comes along and it's like, oh, cool, I'm a heterotroph, I'm going to eat this autotroph. And then I don't know why a tiger would be in the same area as deer are, but the tiger is like, oh man, I'm a heterotroph. Right? I'm a consumer. I'm going to eat this deer. And we're seeing how that energy has changed forms from organism to organism, from species to species, to get to its final form in the tiger. Okay? But there is one exception. Remember, this is in blue and it's in italics. You do not have to write this down. Okay? I just want you to listen. The exception is bacterial living in thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. Okay, this is really, really deep in the ocean, right? If you see here, this is a Finding Nemo. This guy, an anglerfish, you know, they produce their own bioluminescence because there's no light down there, right? I've never watched the movie, but I'm sure that when they were in contact with this guy, I don't know, then it was pretty dark. But there is no light that reaches there. So they do something else. They produce their own energy, so they are autotrophs, right? They produce their own energy, so they're autotrophs, and they do something called chemosynthesis. They use different chemicals and they kind of like string them together so that they can make their own type of energy. That's why they live in thermal vents at the bottom of the floor, because there's a lot of sulfur found there. All right, so moving on, we talked about consumers. Remember, consumers are heterotrophs, right? They eat other things in order to gain energy. What we're going to talk about first are primary consumers, or herbivores. These eat plants. So like deer. I don't know what else is a herbivore. Things like cows. If you are feeding cows right, then they should be eating grassy type things. So they are herbivores. They are primary consumers. If your organism is eating plants, they are a primary consumer, right? If they're eating the autotroph, if the heterotroph is eating the autotroph, they are a primary consumer. Let's move on. Well, things also eat primary consumers. What do we call them? Good guess. Secondary or tertiary consumers. A secondary consumer is eating the other heterotroph, right? I think wolves eat deer. I might be wrong, but I think wolves would eat deer. So if that deer ate some grass, that deer would be a primary consumer. A wolf stumbles on the deer eating grass, and the wolf's like, yummy, yummy, and it eats the deer. It makes that a secondary consumer, right? We can break this into different things because there are things called carnivores, which eat other animals. They eat meat, right? Like cats. Cats are obligate carnivores. They have to eat meat. Things like omnivores will eat both plants and animals, like bears. Bears are a good example of omnivores. They eat meat and they eat other plants. Okay? When we say tertiary, just so you know, it just means above a secondary consumer. So if there was another bigger predator that ate wolves, right, if we're still on that wolf example, then that would be that tertiary consumer because it is a carnivore and it eats another heterotroph. And finally, the unsung heroes, the decomposers and detritivores. These things are like mushrooms. They break down dead organisms and waste material and return nutrients to the soil. So this is kind of like a flow. Do you see how energy is moving from one organism to another, right? So sun hits the leaf of a plant, stimulating photosynthesis. A deer comes in and is like, yummy, a plant. And then a wolf comes in and is like, oh, yummy, a deer. And then eventually, you know, the wolf is going to die. And the wolves will be decomposed by fungi or bacteria, and those nutrients will go right back to the soil. It's sad, but it be like that sometimes, right? Okay, so we talked about the different types of consumers. Now we're going to talk about how, as we move on, you know, as things consume each other, how that energy is transferred. We think about energy transfer, we look specifically at energy transfer in the form of a food chain or food web. We're going to talk about what a food chain is first. In a food chain, we're looking at energy transfer from one species to the next. This is a pretty specific thing. It's looking at one type of energy, right? It's looking at the movement of one specific form of energy. When we say food web, we're showing energy transfer between many organisms, right? Wolves don't just eat deer, they probably also eat rabbits or something. As you can all tell, I don't know much about animals, but wolves also eat rabbits and deer and squirrels, cows if they have access to them, I don't know. But because most species don't just eat one thing, we like to show that in the form of a food web, so that we can see what is getting eaten and what things are getting ate, right? Food chain is one species to the next. Food web is energy transfer between many, right? You know, webs are big, they're intricate. Chains, like, you know, single chain, right? Okay, and these will demonstrate trophic levels. And these trophic levels are really just describing the levels of the food chain. So we're seeing, have you ever seen those triangles where at the bottom it's like grass, and then above the grass are like deer, and then at the tippity top are wolves and other carnivores, right? We actually have a really good reason for that, because it shows how much energy moves on from one species to the next, to the next, to the next, however far that trophic level goes. What's really, really interesting, right? We're going to see how this energy flows, is that 90% of the energy is used at each trophic level, okay? The other 10% is stored in the organism's body, meaning that, I'm a plant, I have 10% stored in my body, the 90% of it is used at the trophic level. So that when a primary consumer eats me, that 10% is what goes to that primary consumer, right? We're not moving a lot of energy between the trophic levels. Not a lot of energy flow is happening there, but just enough to keep them alive. This is a form of energy loss, right? If I am a plant and I'm using 90% of my energy and I'm storing only 10, right? I'm using that 90% to grow, to produce seeds, to stay alive. I can only keep 10 in me, as a storage. A deer eats me, and that deer can only receive up to 10% of that total energy, okay? That's already small. Now let's think about if a wolf eats that deer. It can only get 10% of energy. That wolf can only get 10% of energy from that deer. So we're seeing that not a lot of energy moves on. There's a lot of energy loss. And because of that energy loss, we see fewer organisms at higher trophic levels, right? So we see less secondary or even tertiary or quaternary consumers. We're not seeing too many consumers. We see mostly a large level of primary consumers and a large level of autotrophs. It's because it takes a lot of herbivores to support larger predators, right? If I'm only getting 10% at each trophic level, then I'm going to need to eat more prey in order to survive. That's why we see a lot more herbivores, like there's always a lot more deer than there are wolves. And due to that, there's only so many deer and so many wolves, right? So we can't have an infinite amount of trophic levels. Energy is limited. So at each trophic level, if we keep losing energy, we're not going to be able to support really, really like top of the line predators. So if there's not a lot of energy left to support the predators, we're not going to have large predators like lions, tigers, and wolves. We're just not going to see that because there's not going to be enough energy in the ecosystem to sustain them. Okay, that's the end of our energy lecture. Now we're going to move on to Keystone species. If you want to take a break, now is the chance because this is a whole new set of notes. So moving on to Keystone species. All right. Keystone species are a super duper cool thing. We're going to see why they're called that, but just know this plays into the role of energy transfer and species interactions. So why are they called keystone species? Because of keystones. Do you kind of see this arch? Okay, so this arch, it can form that shape because of this keystone. This stone is key in helping the arch maintain its shape. And so if you were to remove this little stone, right? Well, not little, but if you were to remove this stone, this whole thing would come crumbling down. That's why a lot of species that are important for the integrity of an ecosystem are called keystone species, right? Here's a definition. A keystone species, it's a critical species, meaning it's a very important species. The species that is a keystone species is going to impact nearly every species in the ecosystem. If you remove this species, you're going to drastically affect the ecosystem, and because of that, other species are going to disappear. We're going to see really good examples of that, but a really, really key example are sea otters, okay? In these types of environments, there's something called a trophic cascade that can happen, right? Remember we learned about trophic levels in our previous video lecture, and we said that trophic levels were the level at which species resided in, meaning that they were either an autotroph, they were a primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, quaternary consumer, so on and so forth, right? And there are some delineations, right? There are herbivores and there are carnivores. So carnivores are predators, and they will keep those prey species under control. Now, if that predator species is eating the prey species and for some reason we just killed all of them, it happens a lot actually. We just killed all of them. Then what happens? What happens to the prey species? Now that nothing is killing them, they get out of control. They start partying, they're having kids, nothing's there to stop them. That population increases drastically. Well, that doesn't sound like a bad thing, right? But it is. It is a really bad thing. If all of those prey species, all those herbivores are eating grass, how is that grass going to keep growing? It's not. It's really not. So that prey species overpopulates. It eats too much food, but what are you going to do? You got to eat. So it just keeps eating food. The grass can't keep growing. There's only a finite amount of energy. So we kind of see that the deer population kills the grass. The grass can't support anything else. And because of that, the deer population starts to decline. All of this because of the removal of one species. That's why keystone species are an essential part of their environment. So sea otters. Sea otters are a really good example because they're cute and people like them. But sea otters, they help out with the kelp forests. So sea otters, they eat something called a sea urchin. And sea urchins will eat kelp. If we remove all the sea otters, too many sea urchins, right? All these sea urchins, they're having a good time. It's like, I am safe. Nothing's going to hurt me. I'm going to get out here and eat all the kelp I can eat. And then, the sea urchins start to overeat the kelp, right? There's too many of them. They're just eating kelp. All of the other species over here that rely on the kelp are kind of like, hey man, we need the kelp, stop eating it. But, they're sea urchins. They're not going to stop eating it. And so we see the disappearance and how the disappearance of these sea otters affects the rest of this population. Eventually, because the sea urchins ate all the kelp, the sea urchins will go away. We're seeing this. We're seeing that because the sea otters are out of the picture, the sea urchins, see how barren this food web is? There's nothing left. There's only sea urchins, and eventually they're going to eat all of the autotrophs, and they're going to drive themselves extinct. Right? Do you see how the elimination of one species affected the rest of the species in that ecosystem? That's why we say that it's a keystone species. Without it, the ecosystem crumbles. Here's another picture of it, right? With the sea otters, kelp forests are healthy. They're having a good time. As you kids say, they're living their best life. Without the sea otters, there's an abundance of sea urchins. Those sea urchins have ate all the kelp forests, so they're not living their best life. Okay, remember, this is blue and in italics, so you don't have to write this down. This is just another example of a keystone species, because not all keystone species are carnivores or at the top of the trophic level. Okay, this is a prairie dog, very, very cute prairie dog, but don't go near them because some of them carry rabies. Okay, so coyotes and raptors, which is a type of bird, they depend on them for food. So coyotes and raptors will eat these prairie dogs. Another thing that depends on these prairie dogs, not just for food, are burrowing owls, snakes, and the black-footed ferret. They use the holes that these prairie dogs will dig in order to have a place to live, right? And also, these prairie dogs are good for diversity because they carry seeds around and they unwittingly plant them. Also, when they dig into holes, they kind of churn the dirt around, and that increases the nutrient composition of the soil. It aerates it. It's just overall good for the environment. Okay. A lot of people think prairie dogs are a nuisance, so they will kill prairie dogs, or they trap them and send them out somewhere, I don't know. If we get rid of the prairie dogs, what are coyotes and raptors going to eat? Nothing, right? So we immediately see the loss of coyotes and raptors. Okay, they're gone. There's no more burrowing. Because there are no prairie dogs, they're not making homes anymore, so where are the burrowing owls and snakes and the black-footed ferrets going to live? Nowhere. Because they are not able to find a shelter, they're not going to be able to reproduce, and they're not going to be able to keep their young alive long enough to reproduce as well. So we're seeing how this prairie dog, even if it's not a carnivore, even if it's not higher, if it's not higher than a secondary consumer, we're seeing how the loss of this little cute guy affects the entire ecosystem. Another example, the American beaver. Beavers are very weird, I think, but that's just an opinion. So there are things called high alpine ponds and meadows that exist. And what beavers will do is that they will knock over trees, with their big teeth, and they will create areas called wetlands. These wetlands help control soil erosion. It purifies the water and adds to the diversity of the mountainous landscapes. We get rid of the beavers because people like to wear beaver hats, and guess what disappears? The wetlands. So we're going to see increased soil erosion. That increased soil erosion is going to decrease the bank level, right? It's going to decrease the area that plants can grow. Because those plants aren't growing as much, things aren't going to eat as much. And because there are no more autotrophs, primary consumers are going to get damaged. If primary consumers get damaged, the secondary consumers get damaged. Do you see how that kind of cycles? All right. If you get rid of the keystone species, you are effectively harming the environment. Another great example, we've been seeing different types of heterotrophs. What about autotrophs? Are there autotrophs that are keystone species? The answer is always yes, there is an autotroph. Like aspens, these trees. I'm sure that you've seen these trees around. People get rid of them so that they can make areas for property, so that they can landscape. Some people think that they look weird and, get rid of them. They also people get rid of them so that they can create new streets, new residencies, so on and so forth. Aspens attract different types of birds, insects, mammals that are not found beyond its borders, right? There are some types of insects, animals, and plants that will only grow where there are aspen trees. Also, aspen trees live next to stream sides. So we see a lot of biodiversity. And when I say biodiversity, I mean there's a lot of different types of species living here. When we get rid of aspens, we get rid of the birds, insects, and mammals that will live in the aspen trees. And because of that, we see a loss in some trophic levels. Thus, getting rid of the aspen tree collapses some trophic levels, effectively causing the destruction of that ecosystem because energy cannot cycle, those species cannot interact. Right. That's it for that video lecture. Just a really, really quick recap. We talked about energy flow. We talked about how energy flows through ecosystems, how there are different trophic levels that include autotrophs and heterotrophs. And heterotrophs are broken down into primary consumers. Those primary consumers eat autotrophs. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers. And we talked about keystone species. And we said that keystone species are an organism that are important in maintaining the biodiversity or the different types of species in an environment. And removal of that keystone species effectively breaks the environment. Please let me know if you have any questions. As usual, have a great day.